All right, everybody, welcome to another deep dive
Yeah.
into some fascinating research. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the state of the world's forests in 2023,
Right.
using this 2024 Forest Declaration Assessment as our guide.
Yes, a really interesting report.
It is, and it's got some pretty shocking stuff in here.
Yeah.
So we're going to be talking about deforestation,
Mhm.
looking at fires,
Yeah.
restoration efforts.
It's all connected.
It really is. And the question, of course, is, are we doing enough to protect these vital ecosystems?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? And this assessment really tries to answer that. And they don't pull any punches.
Yeah.
They really lay it out there. But alongside the bad news, there are also valuable insights and even a few inspiring success stories that show what's possible.
Yeah. Okay, so let's start with deforestation.
Mhm.
The assessment's pretty blunt. We are not on track to eliminate deforestation by 2030.
Like
In fact, in
us.
2023 alone, we lost 6.37 million hectares of forest globally.
Huge number.
That's an area the size of Ireland every single year.
It really drives home the scale of the challenge.
Yeah.
And it's not just about losing trees.
Right.
When forests go, we lose these crucial carbon sinks that
Mhm.
help stabilize our climate.
Yeah.
The report estimates that tree cover loss in 2023 released 3.8 billion tons of CO2 equivalent emissions.
Okay.
Just to give you a sense of scale,
Yeah.
it's basically wiping out all the emissions reductions from electric vehicles globally.
Wow. Okay, that's a scary comparison.
It is.
So we're losing forests at a crazy rate,
Yeah.
and it's messing with our climate. But is this deforestation happening everywhere?
That's a good question. And actually, one of the most striking findings from this assessment is that 96% of
Isn't it dumb?
deforestation is in tropical regions.
Okay.
So we're like Africa, Asia,
Right.
Latin America, the Caribbean. These are the real hotspots.
Okay, so tropical forests are taking the biggest hit. Why is that? Why these regions?
It's complex, but agriculture is a major driver, particularly large-scale agriculture for things like soy, palm oil, beef.
Right.
These industries clear huge swaths of forest to make way for crops or for grazing land, all to meet our growing demand for these products.
And the report actually digs into some specific cases that really highlight this link between what we buy and deforestation.
Yeah.
Bolivia, for example, really stuck out to me.
Yeah, Bolivia is a classic example of what the assessment calls deforestation lock-in.
Okay.
The country's economy is so dependent on agriculture, especially soy exports, that deforestation just keeps happening at an alarming rate despite some attempts at regulation. And get this,
Yeah.
for every ton of soy they produce, they clear a much larger area of forest than in Brazil or Argentina, which are, major soy producers.
It's like they're trapped in this cycle of deforestation,
Yeah.
even though they know it's bad for their environment. And then you have Indonesia,
Right.
where even the demand for so-called eco-friendly products is driving deforestation, which just seems so ironic.
It really highlights the unintended consequences of our choices, right?
Yeah.
The assessment reveals that Indonesia is facing more and more deforestation due to the rising demand for things like viscose,
Right.
which is this plant-based fiber that's often marketed as a sustainable alternative to cotton,
Right.
and also nickel, crucial for EV batteries.
Yeah, so stuff that's being sold to us as sustainable is actually contributing to deforestation.
It raises some serious concerns about greenwashing
Yeah.
and highlights the need for more transparency and stricter regulations in these industries.
Absolutely. We need to be more savvy consumers and look beyond those labels.
Absolutely.
So it's a pretty grim picture so far. Rampant deforestation,
Yeah.
especially in the tropics, driven by our insatiable appetite for certain products, even the ones with a green halo.
Right.
But before we spiral into complete despair, tell me about those glimmers of hope you mentioned, those success stories.
Okay, yeah, amid all the bad news, there are some inspiring examples of countries that have managed to significantly reduce deforestation. Compared to their past trends, leading the pack are Australia,
Oh, wow.
Colombia, Vietnam, Venezuela, and Paraguay.
That's great.
These countries have shown the most impressive reductions, and some are even on track to meet that 2030 goal of ending deforestation altogether.
Wow, that's fantastic news. It gives me a little bit of hope. And what about Brazil?
Yeah.
Historically, they've been a deforestation hotspot.
Yeah, they're still in the top 10, but they've made amazing progress in reducing it from their historical levels.
Okay.
Not on track to eliminate it completely by 2030,
Yeah.
but the trend is moving in the right direction.
So what are they doing differently?
Well, the assessment points to a few things.
Okay.
Stronger law enforcement, the reinstatement of the Amazon Fund,
Yeah.
and new incentives for local communities to protect forests. But I think the most crucial factor is political will.
Okay.
The Brazilian government has made curbing deforestation a priority, and they've backed that up with concrete action.
So they're not just talking the talk, they're
Yeah.
walking the walk. It's a great example of how a combination of strategies, policy changes, financial incentives on the ground enforcement can lead to real change.
Yeah, it's a good model for other countries struggling with this issue.
Okay, so we've covered the good, the bad, and the ugly when it comes to deforestation. But now I want to shift gears and talk about a type of forest that often gets overlooked in these global conversations, the forests that are closer to home for many of our listeners.
You're talking about temperate and boreal forests, right? Those
Exactly.
vast stretches of trees across North America, Europe, Russia.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's this misconception that deforestation is primarily a tropical issue, but that's just not true.
Right.
These forests are just as important for our planet's health, and they face their own unique set of challenges.
You're absolutely right. And while most of the carbon emissions from these forests come from degradation rather than outright deforestation, the amount of deforestation is still significant.
Yeah.
The assessment shows that deforestation in North America alone released nearly 45 million tons of CO2 equivalent in 2023.
Wow, I had no idea the impact was that significant.
Yeah, and to put that in perspective, that's roughly equivalent to the entire transport sector of a country like South Africa.
Wow. Okay, so why should we care about these often forgotten forests? What makes them so important?
Well, they play a crucial role in regulating our climate, absorbing vast amounts of carbon dioxide,
Right.
helping to mitigate climate change. They're also vital for the water cycle. They
Oh.
absorb rainfall, filter
Hmm.
water, regulate water flow, which helps to prevent flooding and soil erosion.
Yeah?
And let's not forget about biodiversity. They're home to an incredible array of plant and animal life, much of it found nowhere else on Earth.
Okay, I'm starting to see why we need to pay more attention to these forests.
Right.
But if they're so important, why don't we hear more about them in the context of deforestation? Is it just not as bad as in the tropics?
It's partly a data challenge.
Okay.
Tracking deforestation in these regions is trickier than in the tropics.
Yeah.
We don't have the same kind of comprehensive satellite monitoring systems.
Right.
So it's harder to get an accurate picture of how much forest is being lost.
So how does the assessment deal with this lack of data?
Well, they use a metric called conversion to try and capture the combined effects of various stressors on these forests.
Okay.
Even if it doesn't perfectly measure degradation, think of it like a health score for a forest.
Yeah.
It's not perfect,
Yeah.
but it gives us a general idea of how the forest is doing.
That's a helpful analogy.
Yeah.
So even though the data isn't perfect, we're starting to get a sense of the scope of the problem.
Right.
But what are the main things driving deforestation in temperate and boreal forests? Are they the same as in the tropics?
There are some similarities.
Okay.
Agriculture still plays a role,
Right.
especially expansion of cropland and grazing areas.
Mhm.
But in these regions, we also see a lot of deforestation driven by logging for timber,
Okay.
urban sprawl,
Right.
and infrastructure development.
So a different mix of factors, but the end result is the same: forests are disappearing.
Yeah.
And on that kind of depressing note, I think it's time to tackle another big threat facing forests globally, and that's fires. The assessment really lays out how serious this problem is becoming, and it's something that's been on all our minds,
Yeah.
especially after the recent wildfires we've all seen.
It's a growing concern, and the assessment predicts a 30% increase in global forest fires by 2050.
30%, that sounds absolutely terrifying.
And a big part of this is climate change.
Right.
You know, we see this vicious cycle.
Yeah.
A warmer planet makes forests more prone to fires, and then the fires release huge amounts of carbon,
Right.
further warming the planet. It's this feedback loop that's really hard to break.
And this isn't just some theoretical future threat, right? We're seeing this play out in real time.
Exactly.
Think of the wildfires in California, Australia. Even here in Canada, they're becoming more frequent and more intense.
Right, and the assessment dives into how these impacts vary across different types of forests.
Okay.
In tropical forests that aren't adapted to fire,
Yeah.
like the Amazon, we're seeing a rise in what they call escape fires.
Okay.
These are fires set to clear land that then spread uncontrollably,
Oh.
causing immense damage.
And then you have ecosystems like the Cerrado in Brazil, which is adapted to fire.
Right.
But even there, we're
Yeah.
seeing unprecedented fire activity
Right.
exceeding the natural resilience of these ecosystems.
Yeah.
And that threatens biodiversity and carbon storage.
Right.
And what about temperate forests? How are they faring in this new fire reality?
They're also increasingly vulnerable,
Yeah.
partly because of climate change, but also factors like the expansion of the wildland-urban interface, the introduction of invasive species, and the abandonment of agricultural land, which can create fuel for fires.
So it's a mix of factors, but the bottom line is fires are becoming a much bigger problem for forests everywhere.
Yeah.
And the case of Canada's wildfires in 2023 really highlights this.
Right. The assessment uses that as a case study. Those fires released almost 3 billion metric tons of carbon. And what's even more concerning is that a lot of these emissions might not even be fully counted in official reports.
So essentially, these massive emissions from Canadian wildfires could just disappear from the official record.
It's a possibility, yeah. And it highlights a real flaw in our current systems.
Yeah.
We need a more accurate way to track and report emissions from forest fires.
Right. Because otherwise, we're not getting the full picture of the impact fires are having.
Really?
It's like trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. And it also shows that we need to move beyond this reactive approach to fire management, where we just focus on putting out fires once they start. We need to be more proactive, prioritizing prevention and preparedness.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
A big part of that is reducing the risk of fires in the first place. Things like controlled burns to reduce fuel loads.
Right.
Creating buffer zones between forests and settlements.
Yeah.
And managing forests to make them more resilient.
And I know the assessment also talks about the importance of learning from traditional fire management practices, especially those used by Indigenous communities.
Right. Indigenous peoples have been managing fire for centuries.
Yeah.
And their knowledge and techniques are super valuable for developing more effective and sustainable fire management strategies.
So there's a lot we can learn from those who have a long history of coexisting with fire and managing it responsibly. It's about understanding that fire is a natural part of many ecosystems and finding ways to live with it in a way that benefits both people and nature. Okay, so we've talked about the destruction happening in forests, the deforestation, and the fires. Now let's shift gears and explore the potential for healing, for bringing back what we've lost. Let's dive into the world of forest restoration. The assessment talks about some pretty ambitious goals for restoration.
It does. It mentions the coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which sets a target of restoring 30% of degraded ecosystems globally by 2030.
Okay.
And when we apply that specifically to forests,
Yeah.
that translates to restoring 1 billion hectares of degraded forest land.
1 billion hectares. It's a huge area.
It is.
Are we even close to achieving that?
Well, that's the big question, and the answer is not very encouraging. The assessment shows that based on the data we have, we're nowhere near that 2030 target.
Wow.
Even earlier initiatives like the Bond Challenge, which aimed for 350 million hectares of restoration by 2030, are also falling short.
So what's holding us back? Why are we struggling so much with restoration?
Well, part of it's a monitoring challenge.
Okay.
There's a lack of consistent and reliable data on restoration efforts, which makes it hard to track progress.
So if you can't measure it, you can't manage it.
Exactly. But there is some good news.
Okay.
The assessment mentions that a global registry of restoration efforts called the Framework for Ecosystem Restoration Monitoring is being developed,
Okay.
which could be a game changer.
Okay. So that's encouraging. But aside from the data issues, what are some of the other obstacles to restoring forests on a large scale?
Well, there's the financial aspect, of course.
Right.
Restoration is expensive, and securing funding is always a challenge.
Yeah.
And then there are the technical hurdles. Restoration's not as simple as just planting trees.
Right.
It requires careful planning, species selection, and ongoing management to ensure that those restored forests actually thrive.
Yeah.
And let's not forget the social and political complexities. Restoration often involves land ownership issues, competing land use interests, and the need to really engage local communities in a meaningful way.
So many moving parts. It's like a giant jigsaw puzzle.
It is.
And speaking of puzzles, there's this really interesting finding in the assessment that kind of challenges how we think about restoration, and it has to do with the power of natural regrowth, what they call secondary forests.
Yeah, this is one of the most fascinating takeaways.
Yeah.
It turns out that simply allowing young secondary forests to regrow naturally could be much more effective at removing carbon from the atmosphere than planting new trees.
Okay.
And this is especially true in the lead up to 2050,
Yeah.
which is, the crucial period for reducing emissions
Right.
to avoid the worst of climate change.
So wait, just let the forests do their thing hands off and they'll save us. It seems too good to be true.
Well, it's not quite that simple.
Right.
But the research does suggest that in many cases, natural regeneration can be a far more efficient and effective approach,
Yeah.
particularly when it comes to storing carbon. One study actually found that allowing these young secondary forests to regrow could be 8 times more effective at removing carbon than planting new trees.
8 times? That's incredible. So why are we so obsessed with tree planting?
Right.
It seems like everyone's talking about planting trees these days.
Yeah, tree planting definitely has its place,
Yeah.
and it can be very effective in some contexts. But the assessment challenges this idea that planting trees is always the best or only solution.
Right.
Sometimes nature knows best.
So we need a more nuanced approach.
Yeah.
One that recognizes the power of natural regeneration and prioritizes protecting those existing secondary forests.
Exactly. The assessment advocates for policies that incentivize protecting those secondary forests.
Right.
And integrating assisted natural regeneration into restoration efforts.
Okay.
It's about working with nature rather than trying to control it.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And it leads nicely into our final topic for this part of our deep dive, the link between forests and biodiversity.
Yeah.
I mean, it's obvious that forests are full of life, but the assessment really underscores why we need to protect this incredible diversity.
Yeah, and it starts by reminding us that forests are home to 80% of terrestrial biodiversity.
Wow, 80%.
Think about that. The vast majority of life on land depends on forests.
Yeah, that's a pretty powerful reminder.
It is.
And to highlight this further, the assessment introduces the concept of key biodiversity areas, or KBAs.
Right?
Okay, so what are KBAs and why should we care about them?
Imagine a global map highlighting the most important places for biodiversity.
Okay.
That's what KBAs are like for forests. These are areas that are globally significant for the persistence of biodiversity identified through this rigorous scientific process
Okay.
that considers things like the presence of endangered species,
Yeah.
unique ecosystems, irreplaceable habitats.
So they're like the VIP zones for biodiversity, the places we absolutely need to protect.
Exactly. And when we look at the state of forested KBAs globally, the picture, unfortunately, isn't very pretty.
Okay, hit me with the bad news.
Well, except for Oceania.
Okay.
All tropical regions are failing to meet their targets for stopping tree cover loss in KBAs.
So we're seeing continued deforestation and degradation in some of those biodiverse places on Earth.
Exactly.
And I bet there's a story behind Oceania being the exception.
There is Australia, which dominates Oceania in terms of forest area,
Right.
has seen a big decrease in tree cover loss within KBAs,
Oh.
but there's a catch.
Okay.
This improvement is partly due to a historically high baseline
Okay.
because of those devastating wildfires they had in 2019 and 2020.
Right, so they're basically recovering from a major setback,
Exactly.
which makes their current progress look more dramatic than it actually is.
Right.
Right.
But it doesn't take away from the importance of their efforts to protect these crucial areas for biodiversity.
Yeah.
And it's not just tropical KBAs that are facing threats.
Right.
Temperate and boreal KBAs are also seeing increased tree cover loss,
Okay.
underscoring the need for better conservation efforts in those regions too.
So it's a global issue affecting all types of forests. And speaking of conservation efforts, let's talk about protected areas. I know they're a key tool for safeguarding biodiversity, but the assessment also mentions some limitations, something about paper parks.
Yeah, you're right. Simply designating an area as protected doesn't automatically guarantee its protection.
Right.
We need to go beyond those paper designations
Yeah.
and make sure these areas are actually managed, well enforced, and given enough resources.
Right.
Otherwise, they risk becoming what we call paper parks.
Okay.
Protected in name only,
Right.
but still facing threats in reality.
So it's about quality over quantity when it comes to protected areas. We need to make sure they're not just lines on a map, but real havens for biodiversity. And you know what? There are probably protected forests right near where you live. Have you ever visited one?
It's a great way to connect with your local environment and see the importance of conservation firsthand.
Yeah.
But it's also important to note that protected areas aren't the only way to conserve biodiversity. The assessment highlights the importance of what are called other effective area-based conservation measures,
Right.
or OECMs.
Okay, so what are OECMs and how are they different from protected areas?
Think of it this way. Sometimes conservation happens by accident.
Okay.
OECMs are areas that might be managed for other purposes,
Yeah.
like sustainable resource extraction
Right.
or cultural preservation.
Mm-hmm.
But they end up doing a great job of conserving biodiversity as a side effect.
So it's like unintentional conservation.
Yes,
They weren't designed for it,
right.
but they're doing a good job nonetheless.
Yeah, and the assessment emphasizes that OECMs, when properly identified and managed, can play a valuable role in expanding the overall network of conserved areas.
So it's about looking beyond those traditional approaches and recognizing that biodiversity can be protected in a variety of ways.
Absolutely.
And on that note, I think it's time for a quick break. We've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive,
Right.
from deforestation and fires
Yeah.
to the challenges of restoration and the importance of those intact forests.
Right. It's a complex issue, but there's hope.
There is.
And we'll explore those solutions in more detail in the next part of our deep dive.
So stay tuned, folks. We'll be back soon to continue our exploration of the fascinating world of forests and what we can all do to be part of the solution.
Looking forward to it. Welcome back to our deep dive into forests. In the last part, we looked at the big picture threats facing forests globally: deforestation, fires, the challenges of restoration. Now I want to zoom in a bit and focus on a topic that's often overshadowed by those kind of dramatic events, and that's forest degradation.
Okay, forest degradation. Yeah, it sounds bad, but honestly, it's one of those terms I hear a lot, but don't fully understand what it actually means. Is it just like a fancy way of saying that forests are a bit unhealthy?
It's a little more than that. Forest degradation really refers to a decline in the ecological integrity of a forest. So it's not about outright deforestation where trees are completely gone.
Okay.
It's more about the forest's ability to provide all those services that we depend on, things like carbon storage, water regulation,
Yeah.
biodiversity support.
So it's like the forest is getting weaker, less able to do its job, kind of like how we humans feel after a long week at work.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. And the assessment highlights that forest degradation is a big problem that's affecting all types of forests all over the world. It's like a silent epidemic slowly eroding the health of our forests.
Okay, that's a pretty scary thought. So what are the main things causing this decline in forest health?
Well, it's not just one villain, unfortunately. It's more like a whole gang of environmental offenders working together. We're talking unsustainable logging practices, overgrazing by livestock, the spread of invasive species, pollution from industries, and of course, you can't forget climate change.
So it's like a death by a thousand cuts, all these different stressors adding up to a gradual decline.
Exactly. And the tricky thing about degradation is that it's often gradual,
Yeah.
less obvious than deforestation.
Mhm.
It's this slow creep that can go unnoticed for years until the impacts become really severe and much harder to reverse.
And the assessment does talk about some pretty serious consequences of forest degradation, right?
It does. It shows how degradation can lead to this cascade of negative effects with impacts for the environment and for humans. So, for one, it reduces carbon storage.
Right.
Degraded forests absorb less CO2 from the atmosphere, which contributes to climate change. It also messes with water cycles.
Okay.
Degraded forests can't filter and regulate water flow as well, which can lead to increased flooding, soil erosion, water scarcity.
Right.
And then there's the impact on biodiversity degradation, reduces habitat quality, and fragments forest ecosystems, making it harder for plants and animals to survive.
So this ripple effect that ultimately comes back to bite us humans, it's a good reminder that we're all connected.
Yeah.
And the health of our forests is linked to our own well-being. But one thing I'm curious about is, how do we measure forest degradation? It seems like it would be a lot harder to track than deforestation, which we can kind of see from those satellite images.
You're right. It's definitely more challenging. We can use satellites to track those large-scale changes in tree cover, but degradation is a more subtle process.
Right.
It might involve changes in forest structure,
Right.
species, composition, even soil health. It's not always visually obvious.
So how does the assessment deal with this measurement challenge? How do they quantify something as complex as forest degradation?
Well, they focus on tropical moist forests where we have more data, and they use a specific metric that looks at the percentage of forest area that transitions from a higher to a lower ecological integrity class.
Okay, so they're basically tracking how the overall health of the forest is changing over time, and
Mhm.
are things getting worse?
Unfortunately, yes. The assessment found that over 3.7 million hectares of tropical moist forests were degraded in 2023.
Wow.
To put that in perspective, that's like an area the size of Switzerland losing its ecological integrity in a single year.
That's a pretty sobering thought. And what does that mean in terms of carbon emissions? Because we've talked about deforestation being a major driver of climate change, but I'm guessing degradation plays a role too.
It does. The report estimates that this degradation led to emissions of over 295 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent, which is about the same as the annual emissions of the Netherlands.
Okay, so we're seeing a lot of degradation in tropical moist forests leading to significant carbon emissions. But is this happening everywhere in the tropics, or are some areas worse than others?
Well, all tropical regions are facing degradation to some extent. But the assessment shows that tropical Asia and tropical Latin America and the Caribbean are the biggest offenders. They both failed to meet their targets for halting forest degradation in 2023.
So a double whammy for those regions, high deforestation A&D, significant degradation. It's like a 1-2 punch to their forests.
Yeah, and it really underscores how urgent it is to develop better conservation strategies in these regions.
Mm.
We need to find ways to protect these forests and help them recover before it's too late.
Right, because as we've said, degradation has all these cascading negative effects, not just for the forests themselves, but for the climate, for water resources, for all the amazing species that live there. It's a problem we can't afford to ignore,
Right.
especially given all the other threats forests are facing.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that degradation isn't just a tropical problem. It's happening in temperate and boreal forests, too, although we don't have as much data for those regions. But it's clear that this is a global issue.
And one aspect of degradation that I found particularly concerning, especially in tropical forests, is fragmentation. The assessment talks about this. Can you explain what that is and why it matters?
Sure, fragmentation basically means breaking up those large intact forests into smaller isolated patches. It's like taking a beautiful tapestry and cutting it into pieces. And this can happen because of deforestation, road, building agriculture,
Yeah.
anything that creates breaks in the forest canopy.
So like we're creating these islands of forests surrounded by human development.
Exactly. And the problem is that it creates a lot of edges, those transition zones between the forest and the non-forest areas.
Right.
And these edges are really vulnerable to a whole bunch of problems.
Okay, I'm intrigued, but also a bit scared. What exactly is happening at these edges that makes them so vulnerable?
Well, imagine you're standing at the edge of a forest. You'll probably notice that it's much windier and brighter there than deeper inside the forest. That's because edges are more exposed to the elements which can dry them out and make them more prone to fires. They're also entry points for invasive species pests and diseases that can harm the native plants and animals. And they disrupt the movement of animals, which can lead to less genetic diversity and make populations more vulnerable to extinction.
So these edges are kind of like open wounds, making the forest more susceptible to all sorts of infections and invasions.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And the assessment estimates that a significant portion of tropical forests are affected by these edge effects. About 18%
Wow.
are now fragmented, which is bad news for biodiversity.
So fragmentation is a big problem, and it's connected to all these other things we've been talking about: deforestation, fires, invasive species. It's like this tangled web of destruction.
Yeah, and to deal with it, we need a more holistic approach to forest management, one that considers all these different threats and aims to protect the ecological integrity of the forest as a whole.
Okay, so we've established that forest degradation is a serious and widespread problem. But now let's talk solutions. We've touched on things like natural regeneration and protected areas, but the assessment goes into more detail about specific restoration techniques, and that's where it gets really interesting. What are some of the approaches being used to try and heal these degraded forests?
Well, the good news is that there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Okay.
The best strategy depends on the context, the type of forest, how degraded it is, and what you're trying to achieve. It's about finding the right tool for the job.
Right, because every forest is unique.
Yeah.
And what works in one place might not work in another. So let's explore some of these techniques. What are some of the most promising approaches?
One common technique is active tree planting.
Okay.
They're literally going out and planting seedlings of native trees in areas that have been deforested or degraded.
Okay.
It can be a really effective way to kickstart forest recovery, especially in areas where natural regeneration is slow or hindered by things like soil erosion or invasive species.
So it's like giving the forest a helping hand. Kind of like physical therapy for trees.
Yeah, I like that. But like physical therapy, active planting has its limitations.
Okay.
It can be expensive and labor-intensive, and if it's not done carefully, it can actually harm biodiversity.
Wait, how could planting trees be harmful? That seems counterintuitive.
Well, if you're not planting the right species, or if you plant them in a way that disrupts the existing ecosystem, you can actually create more problems than you solve. It's not just about planting any tree, it's about choosing the right species for the right place. and planting them in a way that supports biodiversity.
So it's not just about planting trees, it's about planting the right trees in the right way.
Exactly.
It sounds like there's a lot of nuance involved.
There is, and that's where the concept of assisted natural regeneration comes in.
Okay.
This approach focuses on creating the conditions for natural regeneration to happen.
Okay.
Rather than relying solely on planting trees, it's about recognizing that nature has this amazing ability to heal itself if we give it a little push.
So it's like helping the forest heal itself rather than imposing our own will on it. I like that it seems more in tune with the natural processes of the forest. But what does it look like in practice? What are the actual techniques involved?
Well, it can involve a range of things.
Okay.
Sometimes it's as simple as removing invasive species that are outcompeting native trees or controlling erosion to make the environment better for seedlings.
Right.
In other cases, it might involve using controlled burns to mimic natural disturbances.
Controlled burns. Wait, isn't fire bad for forests?
Not always. Fire is actually a natural part of many forest ecosystems, and sometimes it's essential for regeneration. Think of it as a reset button for the forest.
Okay.
By carefully using fire, we can mimic those natural processes that have shaped these forests for centuries.
So it's about understanding how natural regeneration works and then finding ways to support those processes
Exactly.
rather than trying to impose our own solutions on the forest.
Right.
It's a more collaborative approach.
Yeah.
Working with nature rather than against it.
Exactly. And the assessment highlights several benefits of assisted natural regeneration.
Okay.
It's usually more cost-effective than just planting trees.
Okay.
It tends to lead to more diverse forests because it allows a wider range of species to come back naturally. And it can be more socially acceptable because it often involves working with local communities who have traditional knowledge about how to manage their forests.
That sounds like a win-win-win.
Right.
But I'm guessing it's not always that easy, right? There must be the challenges in implementing these approaches.
Of course, restoration is never a walk in the park, but the research suggests that assisted natural regeneration can be really effective, especially in the tropics, where those natural regeneration rates are often really high.
Okay.
It's about striking the right balance between human intervention and letting nature do its thing.
That makes sense. But as much as we need to focus on restoring those degraded forests, I think it's equally important to protect the forests that are still intact, those valuable ecosystems that haven't been heavily altered by humans.
Absolutely. Protecting intact forests is vital for everything, for biodiversity, climate change, the well-being of indigenous peoples and local communities who depend on those forests.
Yeah.
These intact forests are like the last bastions of wilderness,
Yeah.
and we need to fight to keep them that way.
And the assessment talks about a specific type of intact forest that's super important, what they call high-integrity forests. What are those and why are they so special?
So high-integrity forests are basically the most pristine and ecologically valuable forests we have left. They're largely undisturbed by human activities and still have their original structure and function. They're like the crown jewels of the forest world.
So they're like those ultimate nature preserves, the places where you can still experience what a truly wild forest is like.
Exactly. And the assessment shows that these high-integrity forests are under threat from all sorts of pressures: logging, mining, agriculture, infrastructure development.
So even these pristine ecosystems aren't safe? Sadly, no. And that's why the assessment calls for urgent action to protect what's left of these high-integrity forests. We need to recognize how valuable they are and take steps to keep them intact for future generations.
So what kind of action are we talking about? What can we do to protect these last strongholds of wilderness?
It involves a whole range of strategies, things like expanding protected areas, promoting sustainable forestry practices,
Okay.
and addressing those root causes of deforestation and degradation, things like poverty, population growth, unsustainable consumption.
So it's about tackling the problem from multiple angles, dealing with both the immediate threats and those underlying causes. It's about recognizing that this isn't just an environmental issue, it's social, economic, cultural order. We need to find ways to protect forests while also meeting the needs of people.
Exactly. It's about finding a path to a sustainable future where both people and forests can thrive. I think we've covered a lot in this deep dive. We've explored forest degradation, different restoration approaches, and the importance of protecting those high-integrity forests. But as we wrap up, I think it's important to connect this back to the listener and what they can do. It can feel overwhelming. Like these are huge global problems. What can one person do?
That's a great point, and it's something we'll talk about in the next part of our deep dive. We'll discuss some concrete actions individuals can take to support forest conservation and restoration.
So stay tuned, folks. We'll be back soon to finish our exploration of forests and discuss how you can be part of the solution. Welcome back, deep divers. We're at the final part of our journey through the world of forests. It's been quite a ride so far, hasn't it?
Yeah, it has.
We've faced some tough realities about deforestation and degradation, explored the challenges of restoring forests, and talked about those incredible high-integrity
And
forests.
now it's time to bring it all home,
Exactly.
to connect all this global stuff to your own life and the choices you make.
Because I'm sure many of you listening are feeling a bit overwhelmed right now. Like, okay, these are huge problems. What can I, as one person, actually do?
Totally understandable.
Yeah.
It can be daunting. But here's the key. Individual actions, multiplied by millions of people, can create a wave of change.
Love that it's like the butterfly effect, but for forests.
Exactly. Even small things can make a difference.
So let's get practical. What can people do to support forests, starting right in their own communities?
A good first step is just being aware of what's happening in your own backyard.
Yeah.
What are the threats to your local forests?
Right.
What groups are working to protect them?
Mm-hmm.
What are the local policies?
So do your homework, get informed about what's going on right outside your door?
Yeah, because we often hear about the Amazon or rainforests far away,
Mm-hmm.
but we forget that we have forests right here that need our help too.
Absolutely. And once you've got a handle on the local situation, what can people do?
Well, one of the most effective things is to support local conservation organizations. There are so many amazing groups out there doing great work, and they need our help, whether it's donating volunteering or just spreading the word.
Right. Those folks on the ground need all the support they can get.
Exactly. And there are things you can do in your daily life to lessen your impact on forests.
Okay, give us some examples. What are some practical things we can do to be more forest friendly?
One big one is consumption. Think about the things you buy,
Yeah.
the companies you support.
Okay.
Do they have sustainable forestry practices? Are they committed to reducing deforestation?
Right. We vote with our wallet.
Yeah, if we buy from companies that care about sustainability, it sends a message and can really change how they do business.
Makes sense. And it's not just about what we buy, but how much we consume.
Exactly, reducing our overall consumption, especially of things that rely on forest resources,
Yeah.
like paper products, furniture, can
So
make a huge difference.
reduce, reuse, recycle. It's a classic for a reason.
It is. And then there's what we eat. Meat consumption, especially beef, is a big driver of deforestation globally.
Mm.
It takes a lot of land to produce meat, and a lot of that comes from cleared forests.
So reducing meat intake or choosing sustainable sources can help ease the pressure on forests.
Hmm.
And for those who are really committed, going vegetarian or vegan is the best option, but even small changes can add up.
Exactly. It's about making conscious choices.
And don't forget about food waste.
Oh, right.
It's a huge problem that contributes to deforestation indirectly. When we toss food, we're wasting all the resources that went into growing it.
Right.
And some of that might have been forest land.
Yeah, reducing food waste by planning meals, composting, eating leftovers can also help.
It's amazing how everything is connected. Our
Mm.
actions really do have ripple effects.
Absolutely. And that brings us to what we can do to directly support forests right here in our own backyards.
Okay, tell me more. What are some things we can do locally?
Well, if you have a yard or garden,
Eh?
planting native trees and shrubs is a great way to create habitat for wildlife
Right.
and improve the health of your local ecosystem.
And for those of us who aren't so good with plants, we can always support community gardens or volunteer at local parks or nature reserves.
Exactly. And even in urban areas,
Hmm.
you can support green infrastructure projects. Things like planting trees along streets or creating rooftop gardens.
Right, because even small green spaces in a city can make a big difference for the environment and for people.
Definitely. And then there's advocacy.
Okay, but when I think of advocacy, I think of protesting and lobbying politicians. Is that what you mean?
It can be that, but it doesn't have to be.
Okay.
It can be as simple as talking to friends and family about why forests matter, sharing articles online, writing to your local newspaper.
So it's about raising awareness, educating ourselves and others, and speaking up.
Exactly. You can also contact your elected officials
Right.
and urge them to support policies that protect forests and address climate change.
Yeah, because our voices matter.
They do.
Our representatives need to hear from us about the things that matter, and that includes forests.
Absolutely. And it's not just about politicians. You can support businesses that are doing things the right way, participate in community events. There's so many ways to get involved.
It's really inspiring to think about all the things we can do both as individuals and together. It's not about feeling powerless. It's about finding those ways we can make a difference.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we all have a role to play in protecting and restoring these amazing ecosystems.
Well said, and I think that's the perfect note to end on. We've explored the challenges facing forests, but also all the ways we can be part of the solution.
Remember, even small actions multiplied by millions of people can have a huge impact.
So, dear listeners, as we wrap up this deep dive, we leave you with a challenge. What will you do to make a difference?
Will you plant a tree, donate to a group, reduce your consumption, speak up for forests, or just spread the word? The choice is yours, and every little bit counts.
And that's a wrap for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us on this journey through the incredible world of forests. Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and keep diving deep.